The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, tweeted that Ukraine will be in danger of reduction of grain production amount by half due to the influence of invasion by Russia this year. And he emphasized the stance to promote grain exportation for the purpose to avoid worldwide food crisis that is scheduled to reopen very soon. And recently, from July 30th to July 31st, there was a big bombardment. There was a fierce bombardment from Russian army, and market capital owning major grain export company in Ukraine was dead. And their house took a direct hit from bomb, and their house was completely destroyed. And Podolak, the advisor of the president of Ukraine, denounced this incident was not simple accident, but this incident was intentional homicide by Russian army. And Ukraine schedules to restart exporting grain under auspices of the United Nations and Turkey very soon. And bombardment by the Russian army causes people's uneasiness about the restart of grain export. And the international community still feels skeptical about whether or not Russia has intention to keep ceasefire agreements. So we're in the situation where the market price of grain remains high because of this kind of concerns to Russia. So moreover, eastern part of Ukraine, where Russia has invaded for a long time, is a major wheat production region. So that there is a question about sustainability of Ukraine's grain export to the world. And actually, for Russian military civilian government established by Russia and Zaporizhia region, located in southeast Ukraine, announced that it agreed selling grain to Middle East in the beginning of this July. But it is obvious that there's high possibility that Russia may go on offensive to retaliate against the economic sanction from the number of countries around the world. And as Putin said, that the world food crisis we are having right now is caused by worldwide economic sanction to Russia. Missile bombardment after ceasefire agreement is old trick of Russia. So the bombardment is surely time buying for Russia for marching troops to southern part of Ukraine to get it under control. So logically thinking, it is not really realistic for the United Nations and Ukraine to request Russia's ceasefire agreement, because how many times Russia broke the ceasefire agreement before, even for the purpose of humanitarian evacuation. So there is no compelling power and there is no backing behind the ceasefire agreement to force Russia to follow this kind of request, because the power balance is rather favorable to Russia currently. So although Russia is, nuclear power and is one of the, permanent members of the United Nations, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, to play a role to maintain world peace and world security, Russia tries to seize food resources from Ukraine and try to invade Ukraine with aggression in the first place. So I just want to ask what exactly the role of the United Nations Security Council is. And this, Security Council of the United Nations should be one of the primary organizations that form the United Nations, and permanent members of this council are liable for maintaining the world peace and maintaining security in the world. But what is exactly the definition of peace declared to the world by the United Nations? So the reason that I feel so contradictory about what Russia is doing as permanent members of Security Council is because the interpretation of the definition of peace declared by the United Nations is totally different from the one we think of. So how do executives in the United States explain this contradictory situation? So what is the meaning of existence of the United Nations? So it is now time to read face of Russia as powerful sponsor of the United Nations. From the humanitarian perspective, the United Nations will have to eliminate Russia from the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Remaining Russia in the current position of permanent members will absolutely unhinge people's trust in the United Nations. So in my opinion, France and British and the United States, as permanent members of the Security Council, should resign their current position and dissolve the Security Council of the United Nations right now forcibly, that no longer function for the maintenance of world peace and world security. And leaders of G7 should establish newly military groups, military organizations, and international law or something like that. So it is no time to say they need to keep formality or something to exclude Russia from the permanent members in accordance with the international law anymore. So just shut Russia out of permanent members right now. There's no need formality to exclude Russia from permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations.